All right, how out? Oh gosh, sorry. Let me. That was like a 1 sec. All right, how is it going, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Forward Thinking Founders, where we're talking to founders about their companies, their visions for the future, and how the two collide. Today, I'm very, very excited to be talking to Vlad Magdalin, who is the co-founder and CEO of Webflow. Vlad, welcome to the show. How's it going?
Hey, Matt. I'm doing really great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on, and I'm very much so looking forward to jamming all things Webflow and no code. And with that, let's just kind of jump right in. For people that don't know what Webflow is, what is it? What are you working on?
Webflow is a bit of a new thing. We like to think we're creating a new category. We call it visual software development. So Webflow is a way to build software visually. And we apply it many different ways. In one way to building websites that are becoming more and more complex and becoming closer to applications. But we did start as a WYSIWYG landing page builder and have graduated into this more sophisticated way to build things that are much more complicated than just websites. And the way to think about it sometimes is to kind of marry the visual graphic side of Photoshop to the complexity of a code base or a CMS or something like that, all brought together in a nice package that a designer or a business user, somebody that doesn't know how to code, can use to get something up and running and scale it.
So let's go a little deeper into that. So I think a lot of people listening, when they think of website builder, they might be thinking in their head of like a Wix or a
Mhm.
Squarespace or a Weebly, this like kind of level that has dominated maybe the last decade. But
Right.
Webflow is kind of adds a few pretty complex and really important layers on top of that. Can you kind of go into what Webflow adds on to the stack and what you're able to do with Webflow that you can't do with some of these other tools that have been around?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's why we call it a visual software development platform that is a lot closer to the types of things people do with code. So with all those other site builders that you mentioned, they're kind of more cookie cutter in the sense that you pick a template. It's very, very easy in the sense that like you can add some images, move some text around, maybe add some pages that have a specific template. Um, it's faster, but it's also really not flexible, right? You can kind of tell when something's made from a template. Whereas like real, scaling companies and startups and brands that want to tell a story and have their own custom sort of website experience and way to target customers, et cetera, they need something that's their own. And typically what happens is they bring in developers and those developers write like custom HTML and CSS and JavaScript to bring that to reality. And Webflow is an abstraction over HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So it's all the power or the vast majority of the power of those three technologies brought into a visual language. So all the kinds of things you sort of can think of Webflow as a non-templated site builder or application builder where you're not starting, you can, but typically people don't start from a template. They're kind of building their vision into reality, and we have a set of tools that makes that possible. So we have a different way to think about coding. You can almost say that you're almost like developing and writing code, but you're doing that through an abstraction, almost like saying, I'm turning the wheel of a car, and that's turning all these levers and gears to turn the actual wheels, but you have this like much neater interface to make that happen. So we think of Webflow in a similar way of breaking down the core components of software or websites where you have like a database, right? Typically you would write like SQL or MySQL or a GraphQL and all these things to set up the database or the CMS. And then you have your front end, you might write like React or Vue or jQuery or Angular to like pull in data from that database into your dynamic website. Webflow just abstracts all that away and still has those core capabilities of making super custom data models, super custom layouts, just in a completely visual way. So the way that I sometimes compare it is if those site builders that were sort of like the last generation were closer to iMovie, like anybody could use it to cut a movie, etc. Webflow is a lot more like Final Cut Pro or After Effects, where anything is possible. Like the top professionals are using it, like wedding photographers are using it, but you can also have like a prosumer or somebody that's just wanting to learn that industry and practice that skill, learn it pretty quickly, a lot quicker than, you know, a 4-year computer science degree or like a 9-month or 18-month boot camp. So it is more sophisticated, but it also brings a lot more power, the power of development into a like a graphical user interface.
So I'd love to dive in the timeline of what has happened in the last 7 years since you got this company started, and what I really want to focus on is at some point in the last 7 years, you realized that there was an opportunity, or you created the opportunity for people that don't know how to code to build things that previously only developers could code or could create. So I have a couple questions in this realm. Was this your vision from the get in 2012? And if not, at what point did you realize, like, holy shit, like, look at what we could do, look at what we could build? And then once you had that insight, did you shift the product direction at all? I'd love to kind of an insight into that.
Yeah, so the insight was from the beginning, because it actually happened a lot earlier than 2012. I started the first version of Webflow in late 2004, 2005, and was sort of the basis of my senior project. And it was always this idea of, here I am as a developer doing this stuff that's repetitive, that I can imagine a visual abstraction to doing that same workflow. Initially, it started as a backend thing. Like, if you're familiar with Ruby on Rails, there's like tools that developers have that make it easier for them to build applications. So my first idea was more around like, how do you make that backend application easier? But in 2012, when we started the latest iteration of Webflow, when I started with my brother, another co-founder, it was that insight already of like, here's Sergi, my brother, who's a designer, and he's doing the creative work, like developing a solution with customers, like really diving into what kind of website or project that we want to build, doing like all the unique work, right? And I'm kind of repeating that same work over and over of translating that vision or that Photoshop file into a WordPress template or something like that, or a WordPress theme, and doing that through code. So that insight in it, like, and there's a bunch of problems there, because like what Sergi imagined as like the interaction or the animation or the design, I'd constantly be saying like, no, you can't do that, or that would take too long, or that's not possible, or like you would make all these tweaks by sending like PDF files across. So it was obvious back then that it was just like an inefficient process, and we knew from back then that that's what we wanted to build. The scope of how far we wanted to go expanded as we kept building the company and saw what people were building with it, and then seeing like, oh shoot, like we need to add animation, then we need to add content management, then we need to add commerce, then we need to add a bunch of other tangential functionality. But the original idea was kind of the same, like why aren't we doing this in a more direct manipulation kind of way, and sort of having this mental model around having to look at a code base and looking at the thing that you actually created and see if that's what you meant, having to go back to the code and like flip-flopping between the two. It just felt very inefficient.
Do you feel like, I mean, you've had this vision now for a while then, but from my perspective, and I'm not in the industry of building no-code tools, so I could be, I guess I'm in the position of most people who aren't building for the builders, but I've seen the perfect storm in a good way in the last 3 years of tons of makers discovering tools to build different no-code platforms. There's the conference that you started, which we'll get into in a second. There's, MakerPad, which has been evangelizing this, for years now. What happened? What happened in the last 5 years, 3 years that kind of brought all of it together? And where do you think the movement is going?
Mm-hmm. So I mean, a bunch of things. The idea of building software visually is not new, right? Like Visual Studio, Power Build. There's so many different things that even people try to get going in the 80s and 90s, and you can go as far back as like the 50s, where there's like the mother of all demos that showed kind of a more direct manipulation approach. But a lot of the attempts sort of fizzled out Or if you think back in the early 2000s when Dreamweaver was really possible, like this, it was sort of like treated as a given that those tools are going to develop and mature. But the outcome of Dreamweaver becoming popular was actually more negative. So a lot of people, a lot of developers had they saw that it generated suboptimal code, and it was very hard to make like production sites with it that were able to scale and be fast, etc. So it sort of like created this idea that like the best attempts are behind us, and a lot of people stopped looking at this space as a possibility. It's sort of like a something to explore, but there's not a big opportunity there because somebody as big as Adobe failed. That's a market leader, etc. It's almost like you could say that there were all these search engines in the late 90s, and the main assumption was that search was a solved problem and there's not a big opportunity there before Google came along. So I think there's a couple combinations of things that caused this to sort of become a resurging theme. A lot of it is based on tools like Webflow being able to prove what's actually possible and showing more by example. Because you can always say these things. We've been saying this, trying to evangelize this for 7, if not 10, if not 15 years now. I can point you to my senior project around like this being a dream. But the proof is in the pudding, right? Because you can say like all this stuff is possible, but there's a lot of skepticism that is overridden by counter examples of like, oh, look, this company launched without code. This company was able to build the entire front end of their product without code. This company exists because they were able to validate the idea by putting up something before they had developers, et cetera. That only comes with social proof, right? And I think, over the first 4 years of Webflow, we were like shipping a lot of things that helped other people ship a lot of things to show that actually is possible. Especially as companies started building their main marketing sites with Webflow, that's when it like really like light bulbs started to go off. Like maybe this is a more efficient way to do things. And also one big thing that is a major factor here is that the web platform became more mature. So browsers weren't even that powerful to be able to create applications within, even 8-10 years ago, right? We had like Internet Explorer, et cetera. And as Google Maps sort of proved that you can actually build apps inside of, more interactive things than just documents inside the browser, this started sort of this war between a good war between browsers to like increase performance, to like treat a browser more as like an application delivery platform than just like a document sort of like reading consumption platform. So the technology matured too to be able to create tools like this, because Webflow wouldn't be possible if browsers didn't mature to that point. So I think a lot of it is like the mindset of proving to more and more people that yes, this is possible. Before, we didn't have that many examples, and at some point there's a tipping point, right? And that's what you're referring to over the last few years, where even developers now, daily I'm seeing developers promoting this kind of the possibilities of no code, where 5 years ago it was sort of like, this is a joke, this is this will never work, etc. There's still some of that sentiment, but more and more the proof is showing that this can really take off. And in terms of where this could go, like the sky's the limit. It's kind of like trying to imagine what spreadsheets could enable 3 years into Lotus Notes being a thing, or thinking about the web in 1995 or 2000, right? It's like we're only seeing the early signs of what's possible. A lot of people still think that no code and visual development is a toy, that it's only for small little projects or whatever. Like we're just scratching the surface. Like we're gonna have uh, entire companies built to be like billion-dollar unicorns or whatever, with visual developers that are implementing business logic and UIs and database stuff completely without opening a text editor. Who knows where that's going to take us? Like we might even be in a world where like no-code tools are built with no-code tools. That's sort of the dream. So it's very hard to speak about the future other than to say like how inspiring it is already from seeing what people have been able to do even at the early stages of this movement, where people have transformed like the way their marketing departments work. People have transformed how they're validating products, and building prototypes and building like turning those prototypes into production applications. People have transformed how, even like you mentioned MakerPad, right? MakerPad is built on no-code tools like Webflow. There's a bunch of other sort of like marketplaces that are now emerging, built on the technologies themselves, promoting like making sure that more people are using the technologies because they're so empowering. Like it gives a lot of building blocks to people that they can now put at their fingertips without having to rely on somebody else. And that's magical. And that actually, for coders, it should also be exciting because each of those things will always have a need for, like super custom development at some point. So it's almost like it rises the entire industry of software development by opening it up to a lot more people. And coders shouldn't be, scared of something like that because it only increases the demand for like more custom development over time.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that because almost maybe a year and a half ago or so, without realizing this was a whole movement, I just was playing with Zapier, playing with Airtable, and I put together something that I call, hopefully one day it goes somewhere, called the Watt Stack, which is at the time, it's actually good. Maybe if you wanted to own it, you totally could, but it was Weebly, Airtable, Typeform, and Zapier, and we scaled to $25,000 a month just on that, for like $200 a month. And
by the way, that stack is compatible to switching out Weebly to Webflow.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Well,
wink, wink.
Yeah, no, that's what because I haven't had a need to build that type of thing. That thing already. But yeah, it definitely works. And all those other tools I think are in the future. Weebly, like we'll see, but I think Webflow is definitely going to overtake a lot of the market share there. So it works. But yeah, I just didn't realize that this no code thing was a thing until I was doing it without realizing it. And then I look up and everyone's doing it. And there's a couple questions I have about no code, but I want to back up a little bit in something that you said that I think is interesting. So you mentioned there are a lot of people in the industry back in 2012, even 2005, thought that this market was done. Like the best has been built, nothing more can come. And obviously that's not true, clearly. But how does a investor, or more importantly, how does a founder look at a market that they're building in and know that if it is done, like, or if there's a lot more room to run? Do you have a methodology on how to think about that?
I'll be honest with you. It wasn't, especially in 2012, there was not just the assumption that, like visual development or sort of like Dreamweaver, like WYSIWYG tools were done. The assumption was that the web was dying. Like every investor, every pitch that we did was like, why are you talking about the web? Like mobile is where it's at. Look at these curves and look at these, you're sort of working on outdated technologies. So that was a challenge for sure. So if we were to apply a framework to it, like whether it's industry trends or even data around growth rates, et cetera, like all the data would have pointed to probably work on something else in terms of opportunity cost. But as founders, what we really wanted to was solve our own problem. We didn't even imagine this becoming like a huge company and a huge movement. It was sort of like, we're building websites for clients, for dentists and orthodontists or whatever, and there's all this pain between like the design and developer handoff, and it just seems like there's got to be a better way. Like we know it's right there, and we see that we can kind of point to like some ideas that we have that can make this easier for us. And even if we make it easier for us, that's already a better world, right? Like we've created some value. Almost originally, I just imagined myself and my brother just like working on this as like an agency, right? Just building more websites and like speeding up ourselves. So it wasn't like this calculated thing of like, how do you pick the right industry and what's going to grow and what's the TAM and what's the market opportunity, et cetera. We were just like chasing this sort of fire in our bellies of, we see this better way and we just want to make it happen. And thankfully, it's a huge sort of combination of good timing and privilege and luck and hard work, honestly, that led to that outcome. But it wasn't like a planned thing, like, oh, we see this huge opportunity and we're going to prove everyone wrong. And It was mostly solving our own problem that we really, really deeply cared about and wanted to do that in a very thoughtful and beautiful way.
In a world full of people that are trying to capitalize on opportunities and kind of mercenaries, you're definitely a missionary. And I feel like the
Yep.
best founders, like you just said, are missionaries. They just do something because they want to do it. They don't care what's going
Yep.
on. They just want to build something. And
Yep.
in your case, it's really working out, which is awesome.
And that's the beauty of the no code movement, in that it can empower a lot more people to do that with fewer stumbling, like fewer things that are barriers in the way. Because I firmly believe that there are millions, if not tens of millions, if not billions of people that have ideas that they want to get out there, like solve some problem, whether it's like in their short sort of or small circle of influence, whether it's down to this something like managing chores at home, right, or keeping track of homework or whatever, through something massively socially impactful, whether it's starting a movement around climate change activism or whatever. There's so many problems that software can solve, that once people know that that's a uh, something that they have in their toolbox, it could be really, really impactful. Because sometimes if you know that you can, if you have like the power of the platform of Twitter, right? If you know that you can post something and get it into the world, or you have the platform of video and on YouTube or whatever, you can tell a story and get people to like really resonate with it. Just knowing that you have access to that medium gives you power, gives you like opportunity to get your idea out there, or your product or your service or whatever. And software is that next step of like bringing something more interactive and more kind of that harnesses the power of computing and computers to solve problems for you. And I think it's only going to keep being more and more inspiring for people as they see more and more examples of what's possible with it. Just the same way that we've seen more examples of code frameworks, right? Like when people realize what Ruby on Rails can do, like people saw, not super experienced founders that were, new programmers build things like Airbnb and GitHub, and all these things were because Rails made it easier, right? We had like the Rails tutorial, and like millions of developers created products because that technology made it easier for them. So the no code movement is just like, that times 10, if not times 100, because it's just like more fundamentally more accessible, and you don't have to be like super technical coder. You still have to be technical. You still have to think through like customer problems. You have to think through logic, like, hey, if I have a product that, let's say, manages chores at home, and I click a button that says it's done, there's some sort of like workflow, like that. Maybe it sends a text message or whatever. This is like, not an app that should probably be built, but just as an idea, you still have to think through technical things, and you still have to like build the user interface and care about the user, and do research around like what actually solves the problem. But you don't have to know like syntax and how to like set up a machine and set up the environment and push code to production and all that stuff. Like that we can abstract away behind better tooling.
So a common critique of no code in general, that I don't have thoughts on. I'm kind of curious to hear yours. Is that
Mm.
if you decide to learn no code tools and not learn to code, you're
Yep.
never gonna be able to build something with new technology. You're never gonna be able to build something like new, like utilizing emerging tech. How do you, is that something you agree with or like disagree with, or how do you feel about building innovative startups on no code tools versus building something uh, technically?
I I fundamentally disagree with it, because it's a common criticism that developers have used over the last 6 decades. So, for example, when CPUs were first invented, processors, you had to know how to send like electrical signals, right? You had to know how to build the hardware to sort of get the computer to do stuff for you. Then we invented like assembly language or machine language, then assembly language, and like assembly language programmers would say, when C was invented, which is a higher order language that didn't do everything that assembly language did, you could like make more performant code or like do more specific things. Assembly language programmers would say, well, if you don't learn assembly, and you're only learning the C language, then you can't really do everything right at the lower level of abstraction, because every abstraction is leaky. And then that pattern continued. Then C++ was invented, right? And like all the C programmers would be like, oh, well, this is something that if you don't understand the core things of like memory management or whatever, then you're not going to be able to build like real things, right? And not going to be able to innovate. And then Java was invented that does like automatic memory management, so on and so forth, right? And then like AWS was invented, and people would say, well, if you don't know how to rack your own computers and set up RAID, then what if this cloud provider fails? Then you're not going to be able to set up your own server farm, right? And that's a common pattern that has kept repeating. But overall, technology has matured to where these capabilities still provide you with all the power of the previous abstraction over time, that then you have a different model for gluing it together, but it's still so flexible that you can build really, really powerful things. And with no code, it's only going to expand like the kinds of things that you're going to be able to build with it, to the point that software that you were able to build 5 years ago, like Airbnb or GitHub or whatever, you'd be completely able to build in no-code tools, as if to the same level of complexity. Maybe, yeah, at the edges, people doing like really bleeding edge stuff like machine learning and like super custom algorithms, etc. Like, yes, there's always value to learning code, right? But there's as much value from everyone learning code as there is value from everyone learning machine code today. Every developer learning machine code or learning assembly. Like, we're so far past that abstraction that we're like using higher level primitives to solve those same kind of problems, and letting computers and these sort of tools solve those problems for us that people had to manually solve before. So I think that it is it's great if you can learn how to code. You're like that skill is always going to be very valuable and very rewarded. But it is not something that should be made a prerequisite to creating software. It's almost like saying, if you can't build your own guitar, you shouldn't be playing music, right? If you don't know how, sound waves travel through air and resonate in different environments and elevations, then you shouldn't, like, you're not a good entertainer, right? So I think that this is, a valid concern and criticism or whatever, and it's an added benefit when you know code, but it is going to become less and less of a barrier to being able to build really, really powerful and impactful things.
I can just imagine what it was like when you were raising your A round. And I'm sure you got that question in many variations. And I'm sure they did not expect an answer like that. But you're totally right. And the fact that you are technical, you can speak to what it's been like, and no one can respond to that. I just can't imagine what it was like raising your A round. By the way, congratulations. That's huge news. I actually want to shift the conversation a little bit to a little bit away from the no code stuff and more on like the business building, what it's been like for you since you started Webflow. So I want to start with, I saw you were on Jason Calacanis's podcast, and he kind of was explaining this new movement called the Pegasus Movement, and it's like better than the unicorn movement in that I don't fully remember, but can you kind of explain what is the Pegasus Movement? Why are you a part of it, and like why did you decide to go that route for Webflow versus the traditional unicorn movement?
Yeah, so honestly, I know less about it. That conversation with Jason was the only mention I've heard of it. But I guess to summarize, creating a unicorn sort of company just means that your company is worth $1 billion or more in terms of market cap. And there's many unnatural ways to do that. We work as a unicorn, and it happened very quickly, but that doesn't mean that they have a strong core business, right? And they're trying to figure that out right now. Whereas Pegasus is, I think Jason's definition of that was a company that grows in value and impact based on strong business foundations. Like, you're either profitable or break even, and the core definition, and you're still growing fast, and you're kind of master of your own destiny in terms of like the company can make decisions on how to maximize their mission and vision based on that actual mission and vision, and based on what the team wants to do, rather than this constant fear of not being able to raise more money and being reliant on investors, etc. So I think that's a much better approach for like mission driven and long-term oriented companies, because building something like Webflow requires many decades for it to reach its full potential. And sometimes, like if you start off with the assumption that this is going to be a super, growth at all costs kind of business, you make decisions that are unnatural for the long term success of something like creating a visual software development platform, because it just needs a lot more time. It needs a lot more gradual growth, rather than just optimizing for revenue, et cetera. So for us, it's like it was really always really important to operate in an independent way, where we always, we partner with investors to help us accelerate that journey, where they can help us, hire more people, help us with kind of processes that we don't have to relearn again, that they've seen be successful at other companies, et cetera. But they're there as a partner. They're there as an equal partner, not like a boss, not a just the person that asks like, when are we getting our money back or whatever. They truly believe in the long-term vision of the company, and are there to support you to make sure that that we reach it together. So that we've sort of used that as a tool, as a strategic tool to figure out how to make our mission happen faster rather than a necessity. And I think that's the definition of it's almost like you would take out a bank loan, right? When you want to grow your business faster, because you can invest, let's say $1 million now that you might not have, and turn that into $5 million, versus kind of the more I guess farcical uh, outliers, where you're creating a business that's burning $2 in order to make $1, and there's no credible way to get that money back in the future. So I think that's the overall theme of the Pegasus kind of label.
Yeah, definitely. And when I like twice a year, I see TechCrunch's headlines when I see Y Combinator demo day,
Yeah.
and then it seems like it appears from the outside, a good amount of those companies do the opposite of that. They raise as much as they can at the highest valuation because they went through YC. But I'd like to kind of walk through your mindset on what happened and what was it like when you went through YC. I feel like there's a little bit of, I mean, I've never been through, so I can only imagine, but there's a little bit of like a pressure to raise. Everyone's like, you're a YC company, so everyone wants it. Like, what was it like back in 2012 going through YC and deciding to be a Pegasus and not just be a rapid growth company like everyone else?
Yeah, to be honest, like we didn't make that decision that early on. We made it later when we realized that it was going to be harder to raise more money, if we didn't kind of focus on profitability and becoming break even, et cetera. But when we were going through YC, the mindset was definitely more around like, I think YC does a great job. Like they don't actually push you towards raise money at at all costs or whatever. And you'd be surprised how hard it is for some companies to raise money after YC. It took us many months. It's like and a lot of companies weren't even able to raise. Like investors still care about fundamentals. They still care about looking into how healthily the company's growing and like what product market fit looks like, or early signs of that look like. So it wasn't sort of like this. I think having gone to a lot of OIC like alumni demo days and looking into a lot of different decks and businesses and talking to a lot of founders, like people do have this mindset of how do I make sure that the mission of this company is successful, and what are the tools I need to do that. And of course you want to create enough runway that you can actually prove that. And it's very hard, especially for a business like Webflow, to completely bootstrap the whole thing. Like I think it would have taken us another decade, if not longer, to build the kind of team that would even to support our own. I had kids at the time when we were starting. We were operating without salaries for close to a year. Like that's a really hard, like we were borrowing against credit cards, like cashing out 401ks, selling cars. Like that's not a sustainable way. And even when we got into YC and started and released our product, like there wasn't enough traction that we could actually pay our salaries. So that is unless you're already rich or somehow have a way to get money from other people that'll like let you borrow it or whatever. Venture capital is a great way to save many, many, many years to try to get to product market fit. And thankfully, these uh, terms now are so founder friendly that you don't have to give up control, or you don't have to give up, like, people are taking a flyer on you as a team and as a product and as a kind of dream to make real. So for us, we were kind of in that same mindset where we were thinking, what do we need to do to make sure that this company doesn't die? And taking in some money as an investment to make sure that we could, like, sustain paying rent and kind of paying for MailChimp to send out emails and all the things that add up, buying sandwiches for lunch or whatever. Um, it's just another tool in the toolbox. But I think YC does a great job of making people think about, like, business fundamentals, and really thinking about what matters to users and delivering value, not measured as revenue. Of course, that's like a good outcome as a trailing indicator, but by, like, making something that people need and that help makes their life easier. So in that sense, I think it's a great program, doesn't have, like, this unhealthy mindset around growth. Although the thing that's most helpful is sort of the camaraderie of everyone caring about getting their idea out there. And when you have so many people around you trying to do that same thing, get their ideas out into the world, it really is, like, provides a healthy amount of, like, pressure and like, you want to impress your peers, you want to, like, be you want to be part of, want to feel like the thing that you want to get out into the world is working. And it's just like that sort of ecosystem of everyone being in the same phase of growth, I guess, is really helpful. But it's not like the partners, chewing you out every week saying, like, you're not growing fast enough or whatever, or you need to raise $1 billion at some, you know, unreasonable evaluation or whatever. I think it's a lot more healthy than that.
I feel like there's a big dissonance between how, like, people outside of we see, like, maybe journalists or media, like, the way they may describe it versus how it actually is. And one day, maybe I'll get the chance to know, because actually the whole way I got into startups in general back in 2015 with my first idea was I got a startup idea, and the first piece of content I magically came across was Sam Altman's 2014 How to Start a Startup Stanford class, and that has been formative. Like, that was my first intro to startups, and it's what caused me to be San Francisco minded, even though I live elsewhere.
Sure.
It was just very interesting how, if I would have first gotten something in Phoenix or somewhere not in the Bay, I would have probably had such a different mindset about startups. But I'm grateful that he did that class so I could learn, I guess, from the best.
By the way, that
Yeah.
that mindset is very much deserved. Like, when people feel that, VCs can force companies to do stuff that's unnatural, that's against their, like, values, or against their users or whatever. Because there's been plenty of examples where that's been, like, a confrontational, or people come in and they, like, VCs feel like they own the place now. They feel like the founders are working for them, and none of this would happen without them, etc. When that's not a true partnership. So there's plenty, I don't want to say, like, hashtag not all VCs or whatever, because there's definitely amazing venture capitalists that care about long-term outcomes, and being a force of good and like, positive impact for the world, by creating these, like, foundational, long-lasting, impactful, socially conscious companies that over the long term generate way larger returns. You look at Atlassian and, like, companies like that, than trying to push for maximizing growth at, like, every quarter or whatever. So, but there are enough bad examples that I can see why people are seeing these bad examples and saying, like, okay, this like, venture capital industry must be kind of, like, have those tendencies all over the place, right? And you have to find those, the examples of things going better are usually not, you don't, like, shout them to the world, because it's usually the bad exceptions that end up being kind of outed to the world. So I can see how people have that perspective, but it really is magical when you find that, like, that partner that believes in you, that supports you as a person, like, sees you as a person, sees the team as people, and, like, really believes in the mission, wants to be helpful to make that possible, rather than, like, how can I make rich people slightly richer already, right? Like, that shouldn't be the driving force.
Definitely. And I mean, recently you probably went on a very long process to find one of these partners for yourself and for Webflow, and you ended up landing on one and raising I believe around, was it $70 million?
72, yeah.
$72 million for Webflow for your Series A after you've had
Mhm.
this period of sustainable growth. I'm just gonna, this is gonna, probably a very basic question, but how do you know that like that's how much you should have raised, more or less? And then also, like, how do you know what to spend it on? It's so much money, at least from my perspective. I know nothing about the inside of the company. How do you
Right.
just pick that number and what do you do with it?
Yeah, good. This is a good. There's no easy answer to those questions. Those things sort of coalesce based on a lot of different factors, which would be super hard to go into right now. Based on the performance of the company and revenue and growth rate and uh, the percentage the company is willing to sell and how much the other investors that are already in the company, like how much they believe in it. There's so many different factors there, and what the company actually needs strategically to operate for the next 5-10 years maybe. And in terms of spending it, like we've always operated in a way that is, there's just like this term of like default alive and default dead. If you're default alive, like you never have to go out and raise more money, and we've always been in that position since like 2015. Default dead is sort of like you have a plan to spend all that money, and then you got to figure out how to get more, right? So we definitely don't have a plan to spend all that money. Like that is a strategic bet to make sure that we are prepared to weather any storms, to make like strategic investments into things that come up without ever having to worry about raising again. Sure, it might happen, but like the entire idea behind this was to make sure we prepare the company for the very, very long term. So it's not like we have, I can give you a spreadsheet that says like, here's how I'm going to buy 100,000 Lamborghinis in across like 2 years or whatever. So it's the plan is not to spend all that money. The plan is to still keep running the company in a way that is fundamentally sound and sustainable, and see that more as a strategic kind of safety net, and the that gives us the ability to invest if opportunities come up, like whether it's like acquisitions or teams that we need to spin up to take advantage of some opportunity that pops up. So it's kind of there as a for that capacity.
Definitely. It's cool to understand what goes into thinking about the money, how it's not just a plan to spend it all. It's a lot more strategic than that. So that's
Mhm.
cool. So we have a couple more questions, a little more time. And I want to finish it off with a couple of questions that I have from Twitter. I tweeted out right before we hopped on. Does anyone have any questions? You retweeted, so thank you. I got some awesome questions. So we're just going to do a little bit of a rapid fire. This is from KP. What are your 3 favorite daily routines that you do, daily or weekly routines that you have?
Weekly, I go on dates with my daughters. Sometimes we skip a week, but that's my favorite thing, individually. So not with both of them. Like I'll uh, flip flop between weeks. So one weekend will be with one, another weekend will be with another, and they get to pick what we do. So that's definitely my favorite. In terms of like daily rituals, I honestly don't. I've kind of lopsided between having very rigid ones where I'd always wake up at 4:30 in the morning and always do this 1 hour of what I called MIT time, most important task time, and it was so rigid that it wasn't enjoyable. And I'd say my one of my rituals right now, because I drive to work, so it's listening to podcasts, and I kind of flip them between things that are entertaining to things that are informative, so that I'm not always in trying to absorb information mode, and then occasionally I'll switch into audiobooks, and also I'll flip those between fiction and nonfiction, so that it's not I don't always have like this overwhelming feeling of like I'm not learning enough or whatever. Sometimes you just want to turn your brain off and be entertained.
Definitely know that feeling. So we have a question from Jeff. Is Webflow taking any initiative to promote teaching Webflow in high school at all, or college or elementary school? Yeah, kind of how is it involved with school at the moment?
Right now it's pretty light. We do have a Webflow for education and for students. There's like a discount, and we partnered with teachers to use it for free in certain classrooms. But this is a major theme that came up in our last all-company offsite in August, and something that is that we're really thinking through on our education and our community team. That's going to be probably a major theme in 2020.
All right, I got a couple more. Then I'll have. There's the final one. When will you be? This is from It's Nick. I believe it's at It's Nick. When will you be able to remake Webflow using Webflow?
Whew. At least the middle of next year. No, just kidding. It's probably going to be a long time before no-code tools get to that level of complexity. That is definitely not the standard that we're shooting for, because there's literally like 2 or 3 companies that would want to build something like Webflow, and organizing around that use case is probably not a great because it'll be way too complex. In that case, using code is still the best tool for the job. But give it 10 years, and that might be a totally different answer.
That's exciting times. One more from me, and then the same one that we always ask to finish it out. This one is probably one of the hardest hitting questions that you've ever gotten, even out of every investor meeting. So get ready. You tweeted recently that you spend $125,000 a month on tacos. Can you please explain how this works?
With the caveat aside that whole thing is a massive joke, somebody actually did do an analysis of like, for a company that is 150 people, if you do tacos breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that's actually a reasonable amount of money to spend on tacos. But we do not spend that much on tacos. It was
if you did, here's my assumption. If you did, I bet you would up your application intake to like by I don't know, by 50 or 100 or 200%, because tacos are like a fan, especially of my generation and Gen Z. We love tacos, so just putting that out there for your recruiting knowledge.
See, that would have sounded 7 years ago like ding ding ding, great idea, and then now my brain goes into, well, what's the healthcare cost of people eating tacos day in and day out, and is that going to cost us more than $125,000?
That's funny. That's funny. Cool. Well, I have one last question. It's the same question I always ended up with. Thank you again for coming on to the podcast. Awesome conversation. My last question is, you are building Webflow and you kind of planted the flag in the ground to like lead this no code movement. And that's a big responsibility. That's going to take a lot of work, and you're going to need some help along the way. And you got a lot of people listening to this podcast who want to help. They're listening because they follow you. They like Webflow. So they're almost like ready to help. So my question for you is, what is a way that the forward-thinking founder community can help you or help Webflow further along the mission of what you're trying to accomplish?
Thank you for asking that question. I think it's primarily helping to drive this mindset change, because when founders see how much more effective their marketing teams, their product design teams, their prototyping teams can be without having to have like even development teams. Like we have a lot of developers on our own team who are using Webflow to prototype certain solutions and then kind of like taking it to our code base. It's very helpful when founders sort of dive into the possibilities of this and see how they can make their own teams more effective. That only perpetuates this mindset that yes, more is possible, and that will drive more demand on tools like Webflow to become even better, because that's the thing that helps us create more powerful tools, more easy to use tools, more use cases, more sort of like verticals and more capability. It's when there's like people are hungry for it because you need to solve business problems with it. But if we don't change that mindset that you can only do real things with text-based developers, it's not only worse for all of these businesses, right? We have more than half of YC's startups now. When they build their website, they're using Webflow because it's just a massive waste of technical co-founders' time to be building writing CSS style sheets and HTML like layouts or whatever, or setting up some sort of static site generator. It just means that you can focus on more important problems. And I think that founders should, like, not only to help their own businesses, but to sort of lift the entire tech industry, to encourage others to explore these tools, because it's a it's a fundamentally more accessible technology when it comes to taking advantage of the power of the internet. Because when you're saying that you don't have to be one out of 400 people on earth that knows how to write code in order to create software, but really anyone who wants to dive in and spend a few weeks like learning this stuff can actually do it. And maybe right now it's a small subset of software, but like it's growing rapidly. Then overall the tech industry can grow a lot faster, and we can just do a lot more together, I think. So yeah, I don't see a downside to sort of spreading that message that you don't always need code to build software.
All right, you all heard it here. Spread the word. Vlad, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm looking forward to the next decade of what you're going to do with Webflow.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Matt. I really appreciate it.